Ladies and gentlemen, our panel will have about 45 minutes to bring this conversation together. And after that, I will be begging leave, unfortunately, have to catch a flight. But it was a pleasure being amongst experts and specialists who are so keen and passionate about this subject. So thank you very much for your presence. Ransab, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. When we talk about the issue of trafficking in persons, so it's a global issue and no country of the world is immune to it. So it really means that if we want to address this issue, we need to have global cooperation. And for this, we are really privileged to have with us such a distinguished panel with us who will talk about their experience and the interventions that they have designed to address this issue, not only in the USA, but also internationally. To initiate this discussion and provide a context, I will ask each of the panelists, a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So I will request our guests to please briefly answer the questions so that at the end we have some time left to take questions from the audience. So Nash, I will start from you. So what type of services does Human Trafficking Training Center USA provide? And how have those services influenced the anti-trafficking response?
Thank you, sir.
You need to. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting us and for having us be here at this wonderful conference. So the Human Trafficking Training Center, what we do in the United States and all around the world for that matter, is train law enforcement in how they need to respond and investigate human trafficking cases. What we found in the United States was only about 17% of law enforcement in America was actually trained in human trafficking. And if you actually broke that down from awareness-based training to skills-based training, what we saw was that it was only about 8%. So only 8% of law enforcement was actually trained in properly how to respond, identify, and actually investigate human trafficking. Once we trained officers how to do that properly, what we saw was a tremendous amount of increase in victims that were identified, and also the investigations that were conducted, as well as the prosecutions that ultimately were coming in from the backside. We just could not expect law enforcement to properly respond and investigate things that they weren't properly instructed on or trained on. So once we started changing that, we saw a greater increase in the overall response of trafficking.
And I just read that you develop a particular methodology as well for the training or for the investigation of cases. So can you please briefly, educate us about that methodology?
We do teach a victim-centered approach to all of our law enforcement officers in the United States. Alistair and I actually created something called the Special Victims Methodology. And what that does is it increases the way that law enforcement will respond and contact a possible victim of human trafficking. The research is pretty clear. In the United States, only about 7% of all trafficking victims will disclose to law enforcement. So when we created the Special Victims Methodology, we wanted a better way of doing that, right? Because trafficking victims are not sex assault victims, they're not sex abuse victims, they're different. It's apples and oranges, and a traditional law enforcement approach does not work very well. So when we created the Special Victims Methodology, that has increased the disclosures from trafficking victims to around 45% from 7%, which is pretty significant when you're talking about being able to identify trafficking victims, but then to prosecute traffickers.
So much. So, Alison, over the years, we have observed that, the number of identified victims of trafficking have been increasing. But on the other hand, when it comes to the prosecution and convictions, we have not made any significant progress. So what could be the possible reasons, and how can we really improve prosecution? So
that's a fantastic question. So the increased identification of victims, I would say, is the byproduct and the result of awareness campaigns like that that have been discussed here this morning. The more that you bring education and awareness across your country, regardless of the sector, you will see the number of victims identified, those numbers increase, and that's fantastic progress. But taking a victim identification across the finish line, if you think about it as like a race, there are many other steps along the way. Identifying the victim is really only the first step. Now we have to report that, and you have to have a reporting system in place that actually works. A potential reporter needs to know how to report, where to report. The report has to be received by somebody who can follow up and investigate it, and then so that you have to have training along there, and then you have to have your prosecutors and the judges who are also trained on that get it to there. So there are many, many steps along the way. And you have to have the resources allocated to it. They have to be properly trained, and if anything falls apart down that road, you won't get it across the finish line. So that's why.
Wondering if you have some data about the percentage of convictions in the USA. I'm not sure if you have, but
It's also very small, and for the same reasons. Why is that? If you have any one step along the way not followed through and pass it along to the next one, you won't get it to that conviction.
thank you. So, Mr. Kevin, you have established a National Child Protection Task Force. So can you please briefly introduce that? What are the objectives of establishing the task force, and how that organization is actually contributing towards this issue?
So the National Child Protection Task Force, I'm a prosecuting attorney, so my background goes in, I've been in the military, state, local, and I worked in federal law enforcement. I came out of that and went to law school. I've been a prosecutor for about 12 years. But it became very apparent that the U.S. legal system, and probably legal systems around the world, are very slow to keep up with changes. And we all know how fast technology can change things. So as Allison was pointing out, there are so many steps along the way where failure can occur. If you're looking at technology-enhanced crimes, if you don't ask for the data, you don't know what to do with the data, and you don't know how these predators are hunting our children, how they're identifying the victims, that doesn't get into the investigation, doesn't get into the prosecution. So there are a lot of steps there. The National Child Protection Task Force was formed out of a necessity. What I was seeing were investigators around the country who were maybe getting experience working with Google or with Facebook or some other technology company, but then they wouldn't do it again for another 6 months or a year, if ever. So that experience was lost. So we started forming a group where we would share those experiences and we would get more repetition on working in technology. So the NCPTF is made up of active investigators around the world, active duty prosecutors. I've got active duty military who are able to work with us. And we have technology professionals from various areas in technology. So we all started working together to figure out how do we identify victims and how do we identify these traffickers, these predators. We also work a lot in child exploitation. But what a lot of the governments have found out are the things that we do with technology apply to anything. It applies to terrorism investigations, drug investigations, anybody who carries a cell phone. All of that works the same way. Just being able to identify who is this victim or who is this suspect through technology. And then when that goes into prosecution, a lot of times it can lessen the burden on victim-centered prosecution, where you have to rely solely on the testimony of a victim. That can be very, very difficult for prosecutors and for judges to take that victim approach. If you have technology and you know what to ask for and what to do with it, that gives a prosecutor more evidence, more tools, and more ammunition to work with But our prosecutors have to be trained, and that's why we have prosecutors actively working with us to develop methodologies, to develop ways of introducing evidence, getting them into evidence so that the judge and our jury system can understand how all these pieces fit together.
So much. You're very much right that we need to use technology, and the last year theme of the United Nations on the International Day Against Trafficking in Person was also the use and abuse of technology. Thank you so much. So, Mr. Edward, when we talk about the issue of trafficking in person, so there is a general misunderstanding that this issue only exists in developing countries like Pakistan. So, could you please share with us that what types of trafficking exist in the USA, and are there any particular reasons for the existence of those types?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank my fellow panelists and most importantly, everyone here. This is my second tour in Pakistan. I've been with the department for about 15 years now. And over the past 7 years, I've been working on trafficking from an international standpoint. And I'd like to begin the conversation. I want to answer your question, but I think it's important to frame this in a way that the US government has been dealing with trafficking for a long time. And the story goes back about 23 years ago to the Palermo Protocol. And then in the year 2000, we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And from that act, most of the things that we've been working on over the past 2 decades have evolved. One of the things is the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And we're probably going to talk about that. I'm sure there's going to be a question about the TIP report somewhere in here. But in the US, and we're all sitting up here as experts. However, I want everybody to understand that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this, and it's not necessarily a fact that the American government got this right, because we have tons of trafficking in America. And has anybody seen the movie Taken with Liam Neeson? It's okay to admit it, right? So for those who haven't seen it, the movie did something which has brought trafficking to the forefront. It brought it to our attention. However, what it did was it Hollywoodized it and focused on sexual trafficking from perspective of these influential people who are getting trafficked for money. However, the victims aren't the wealthy. They're usually the society's invisible. And we have that in the United States. And I think that what you'll find is probably if you took a poll, and usually a lot of our data is taken from information obtained from a tip line, a hotline. And we compile that data, and it's about 50-50 sexual trafficking and labor trafficking. And what I would tell you is, and I'm probably taking up too much of my time, but the Pakistani people, the country's beautiful. The people themselves are wonderful. They're intelligent and they're hardworking and they're easily exploitable. And why do I say that is because I work on the front lines of the consular section. My main job is to sit in the consular section and catch these cases as they come in. And we see a lot of F1 and J1, which are your student visas and your cultural exchange students, being taken advantage. They're falling victim to this. And when we have what's called the brain drain in Pakistan, I think that one of the main focuses we should look at is protecting some of our skilled labor. We have hardworking, intelligent people here, and they could fall victim to that. So what I would say is the reasons are many, because exploitation is a human condition. It doesn't stop at the national borders.
Thank you. So, Mr. Dan, Mr. Ross talked about Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So can you please briefly share with us what are the salient features of anti-trafficking legislation in the USA?
So the trafficking, or the Trafficking in Persons Protection Act was first passed in 2000. It's been reauthorized several times since, and it's very similar to what the law is here in Pakistan, to be quite honest. It's divided into 3 parts. There's an action part, which would be like recruiting, harboring, transporting, anything like that. And then the second part is the method, and that is basically like using force, fraud, and coercion, unless they are under 18 years of age. Our law in the United States is that if they are under 18 years of age, you do not need to prove force, fraud, and coercion. And then lastly, it's for the purpose. And that purpose could be sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or forced criminality of a variety of different means. So that's what it is. Each state in the United States also has their own human trafficking law, which is very similar based to the federal law, to the TVPA. And then that is our overall framework that we utilize to prosecute cases. And I heard this talked about here this morning as well. And what we see with that is, although the law is pretty good, and in most states the law is pretty good, in some states the law is really, really good. But what happens is it doesn't really matter how good your laws are if the police are not trained to actually investigate properly. The whole system will fail and start to fall apart. There's one state in particular that we have in the United States that has probably the best and the most rigid trafficking laws in the country, but they don't do a very good job with investigating human trafficking. And the reason is law enforcement in that particular state is not very well trained. So you've got to have the two to go together. If you just have the laws and not the training, or just the training and not the laws, the system will break down.
One of the, key form of, or not key, but one of the dominant forms of trafficking is trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, right? But when we see the TVPA, so I don't think so TVPA include trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. So I'm just wondering, in the USA, do you have any separate legislation? Because TVPA exclusively talks about trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation and sex exploitation. So I'm just curious. So do you really include organ trafficking as a form of human trafficking in the USA, or there is separate law for that?
So we mainly what most people are going to see, which is what they see on television and movies and social media, is sex trafficking and labor trafficking, right? But there's all kinds of other stuff that's going on too. And we don't have certain things in the United States that some countries have, like child soldiers, or we don't have a ton of organ harvesting and things of that nature that some countries do. But what we do is we have something called forced criminality. And that is where the traffickers, I think I heard someone talking about it this morning, about begging, forcing people to beg at the street corners. We have forced criminality where traffickers force people to commit financial crimes, like writing hot checks, or stealing credit cards and using credit cards. Doing robberies to sex buyers, which we refer to as trick and rolls in the United States. So there's what we refer to as forced criminality, can take place in a variety of other crimes that law enforcement traditionally misses. We just think of someone as, oh, well, they're just a drug trafficker, or they're just involved in a financial crime. But if you actually look into some of that, what you'll find is some of those victims are actually being forced to do that by a trafficker.
Thank you so much. So listen, in the previous section, we were also talking about coordination among stakeholders and how vital it is. So still the coordination among stakeholders remains a daunting challenge to prosecute traffickers and provide timely and effective support to the victims of trafficking. So how can we strengthen weak institutions that are not sensitized to victim support? So what steps can be taken?
I think the greatest thing that we can do, whether it's law enforcement, service providers, or so forth, is increase training and education. That is the greatest way that we can increase our capacity, right? And I'll tell you, I see this in the United States. We have thousands of law enforcement in the United States. The vast majority of them are not trained. If they were properly trained, if they had the skills to identify this and the ability to follow up and investigate properly, we would turn a whole army of people who are in a position to do something into capable soldiers, if you will, in this. And then the other thing that we can do to increase capacity is bringing stakeholders together across disciplines. Having your law enforcement coordinating with service providers is one of the greatest ways that we can take resources that are already out there but are not properly equipped to do it. Is what I have seen as it's a force multiplier.
Recently in Pakistan, we have established trafficking in persons committees at different tier, and federal, provincial, and then up to the district level. So I'm just wondering, in the USA, whether do you have any formal mechanism where there are representatives from, different stakeholders like law enforcement agencies, service providers, civil society organizations. So I'm just wondering, do you have any formal mechanism?
So we, in the United States, some of I would say the better organized formal mechanisms that we have for that are the creation of different task forces. So when I worked for the state of Missouri, that was my job. I was the director of our statewide task force, and my entire job was to be a convener, to bring the law enforcement partners together with service providers, and other people who work in sectors that are in key positions to identify and assist victims of human trafficking and getting them to work together. It is a force multiplier, but what I'll also say about those task forces is that many of them are not very effective. And I think the reason why that is, it again comes down to training and education, and really having a vision for what's needed to build up those steps that we were just talking about. Identifying and then taking it all the way to the end, across the finish line to a conviction. Building up all of those steps so that, as Kevin said, there's lots of opportunities for failure along the way. And if you convene people across sectors who are all necessary to get it across the finish line, that's where you'll be successful.
Thank you. So when we talk about trafficking in persons, so we know it's not a random, process. Traffickers particularly prey on the vulnerabilities of the marginalized communities, or particularly those people who are already in the situation of crisis. So my question for you, Kevin, would be that different victims of trafficking might have different vulnerabilities and needs depending upon their age and gender, etc. How victim assistance programs or interventions could be developed in a way that they are responsive to the specific needs of trafficked victims, especially with reference to their age and gender?
As a prosecutor, we don't work a lot with the victims once they are through the process, but a concept that I have been speaking on, and right now we're trying to bring people together to address all these. If you think about, and to a point that you made earlier, that the U.S. is not on top of this. I mean, we've been making a lot of progress over the last couple of decades, but we still got a long way to go. So hopefully you don't think that we're coming here with all the answers, because all we can tell you is these are the challenges that we're facing, and we're still struggling. So I think you have done a tremendous job bringing this together. But for that, I like to think about this in a before, during, and after concept. We are active in the during part. Something has happened. We are looking for a victim. We're looking for a predator or a trafficker. We're looking for somebody. We're actively engaged because something has happened and we're responding to that. After the victim is identified, they go into the aftercare. So the victims, we need people who specialize in that. In the US, 10 years ago, I remember, we would go do an operation, we would arrest the trafficker or arrest the bad guy, and then we would have these victims, and we'd say, what do we do with them? That's not us, that's not law enforcement. So that became clear that that was an issue, and it's still a challenge right now. But a control mechanism, for example, is addiction. The traffickers will use drugs or other Romeo scams. There's the romance. There's this illusion of trust. The grooming process creates so many problems with these victims. A lot of the victims don't fully get that they're being victimized, and they still have this attachment, this trauma bond, essentially, to the trafficker. Those victims are going to need substance abuse counseling. They're going to need therapy. They probably need job skills because they don't have any skills that will allow them to earn a living. They've probably got kids to take care of. So there are so many things on the victim side. And getting back to the before, during, and after. So the during phase, when we're identifying these people, the victims have to go somewhere and they need care If they don't get that, they slip right back into it, and all that work is for nothing. So the traffickers, we have to take them to prosecution. On the after side, traffickers go into prosecution. That is a huge challenge because a lot of the cases that we get are victim focused. I have to have the testimony of a victim in order to convict this person. And a lot of the times the victims will disappear or they will refuse to cooperate, or if you're a prosecutor in here, you know what I'm talking about. There are so many challenges. So the during phase, when it goes into after, you've got prosecution. So we've got to bring them across the finish line, as Allison said. We've got to take all of that work and keep it going until we get that conviction. On the victims, we've got to bring them in. We've got to give them aftercare, substance abuse counseling, whatever it takes. Now, if we look at the before side, what we don't do in the U.S. very well is learn from the lessons learned and the mistakes we've made. So as we do these investigations and prosecutions, we have to take those lessons learned and bring them back on the before side. What are we learning from doing all of this? What are we learning from working with these victims? How can we take all of those lessons learned and bring them back into training parents, training teachers, training our community leaders? Also, the laws that you have passed, and it sounds like, and from what I've seen, you've done a tremendous amount of work. You've got the framework. You've got the legal framework. Now you've got to execute. So during this entire phase, you also have to take those lessons learned and go back to your lawmakers and say, you passed this law, this is probably what you intended, but this is how it's working. We need to change it and adjust it. So I think we need to think of this a little more broadly, and don't get hung up on analysis paralysis. You have done a tremendous job of setting this framework up. Now what you've got to do is figure out, how do we execute? How do we get these cases in the pipeline? How do we get our prosecutors going and our judges convicting? Thank you.
And you are right, execution is the real problem that we need to work on. So, so Edward, if you want to, find data on trafficking in persons globally, so we know it's very difficult to get global data on this issue, but perhaps one of the best sources is Trafficking in Persons report, right? So each year US Department of State publishes Trafficking in Persons report, where countries are ranked on different tiers based on their performance and initiative that they have taken to address this issue. So could you please briefly share with us about this ranking in the TIP report, and especially, we heard a lot of criticism about the sources, like from where actually you get the data on the basis of which countries are ranked. So please briefly share with us that how countries are ranked and what are the basis of data or information.
Absolutely. I'd like to start it off with kind of piggybacking off what you said is about the human trafficking cases are a victim-central investigation, and that is coming from a survivor-informed approach. It's coming from a trauma-informed approach. And so when we talk about training our officers on how to handle these cases, it's not like we're focused on the criminal where, okay, we caught the bad guy, we're going to throw him in jail, that's the end of it. These cases last a long time. And this, in the kind of a national action plan that you have that was demonstrated to us by FIA, is mirrored. It's almost identical to our own. Our President of the United States puts out the National Action Plan, and in it are the 3 Ps. Here you had 4 Ps because we kind of have a 4th one as well, but it's you have to first prevent trafficking, you have to protect those who have been trafficked, and then you have to also prosecute those who are trafficking. And you do this through partnership. Now that kind of approach is found in, I'm gonna take another poll. I know we have some movie watchers here. Anybody who has ever read the Trafficking in Persons report? Okay, I'm not front to cover. I mean, there's 600 pages, but so if you haven't read it, and if you have, go through it again and take a look at it, because when we break down each country, it's separated in those Ps. Okay, each country is separated by how to protect, how to prevent, and how to prosecute. And so when we're talking about the National Trafficking, the JTIP report is what we like to call it, comes out every year. And I mentioned before the TVPA, which created our Office of Monitor and Combat Human Trafficking, or Trafficking in Persons. This report is provided not as a, hey, this is what everybody's doing wrong. It's more of a raise awareness and help prevent human trafficking. So when and if you haven't read it, or if you have, we go through and, yes, you said ranked countries in tiers: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then there's something in between tier 3 and tier 2, which is a watch list. Obviously, tier 1 is, where you would like to be. However, I've gotten this question before, and I've done these talks, and you raised a question about the sort of like, hey, where do you get off calling us tier 2? It's when I want everybody in this room to understand one thing that is very critical about the JTIP report. You are not being ranked in comparison to other countries, okay? Otherwise, you'd have 1 through 185 or whatever. You're being ranked in comparison to yourself from last year. So the only competition is with your own self. And what that is showing, if you want the secret to the sauce, everything is based off of the TVPA. And those rankings are based off of whether or not you're meeting the minimum standards of the TVPA, of what we have, and also showing some sort of significant growth towards either maintaining or improving. So that's really where, if you want to go from 3 to 2 to 1, and how to stay in 1, that's what you need to focus on. And the sources of data, okay, I work with the Department of State. Now, if I get a chance, I'll probably talk a little bit more about the whole government approach here. But we're all over the world, and there's a person like me in about 192 countries right now. And we also work with our political offices. The U.S. Embassy collects data from host nation, and then we also get information. People who have governments or entities have submitted directly to JTIP through their channels. The embassy will also pull together all the law enforcement entities, and myself included, to get an update on what's actually happening with our partners that we've been working with. And they send all that data into the United States Washington, D.C. machine, and they compile it and edit it and produce this report once a year. So the sources are widespread. And so just one thing I just want to leave you with is it's not a comparison with anyone else but Pakistan.
There is one another misunderstanding. That is, tier 1 means no trafficking or very few cases of trafficking. So please clarify this as well. That
Right.
does not mean no trafficking.
Unfortunately, and if you look at the trafficking report, everybody has every tier has a color, and they labeled green as tier 1, and then red is tier 3. So it automatically gives you this impression that, oh, green is good, red is bad. That's not the case. It's where you are at in your journey on how you're combating trafficking. So tier 1 only means, like I said, you're meeting those standards and you're showing significant improvements. And what I've seen here today, what I've heard here today, and from what I've done a 10-year analysis of where Pakistan has been, and I give these presentations to our university students, and like I said, maybe if we have time, I'll talk about it. But there has been progress, significant progress, and this conference here today is one example of that, and that's why I wanted to thank you all from the beginning for being here, because this is impressive and important.
Thank you. So with the permission of our guest speakers, should we open the floor for questions? I know you have many other points, but perhaps we can cover those points in questions. So yes, madam, please.
Thank you, Usma Kardar. I am a parliamentarian from Punjab. From what I've heard, the US also has a long way to go, like you just told us. We are struggling because for 4 years, when I was a legislator, we were working with the victims of TIP. But the major problem is it's an invisible crime. The people who are being exploited, they're very, very vulnerable. And believe me, I have dealt with a lot of these victims, which are largely women. They're threatened. Their lives are threatened because it's a very organized network with a lot of influential people and tons of money. So I think the main problem facing Pakistan, that we need interdepartmental coordination with different law enforcing agencies, especially our intelligence network. Because you have to crack into these, we need sting operations. Otherwise, they are so strong that they really, the victims feel threatened. Their lives are threatened. They will never come out into the open. They will never tell you and they don't feel protected anyway. So how can you people help us, in cracking these influential networks?
Sorry, I'm jumping on this one. Okay, I wanted to talk about U.S. government structure. So for those in the room who aren't familiar, the executive branch, we have multiple departments, and I've been over 54 countries within my past 15 years, and one thing I've recognized is that every country is confused when they work with the U.S. government because we have so many different kinds of departments. The Department of State, I'm gonna identify 4 in particular: the Department of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Labor. Why do I mention those 4? It's because in our national plan, the president has identified 4 law enforcement agencies who are charged with focusing on human trafficking. And in our government, with the departments, each one of us has a specific jurisdiction. So with the Department of Justice, FBI is the ones who are leading that. Within the Department of Homeland Security, you've got Homeland Security Investigations. Sometimes you've heard them called as ICE. There's confusion on it. The other one is the Department of State. That's where I come in with Diplomatic Security Service. And then the Department of Labor, they're OIG. Those are the 4 law enforcement agencies who are responsible for this. When you break that down in the individual offices, my office is the Overseas Criminal Investigations Program. So I've gotten this question before because what I do is part of my platform is I work training FIA, I go to hotels, I go to airlines, and I talk about how to identify document fraud and so forth. One thing that we've really pushed for this year is human trafficking awareness training and prevention. It's been a platform of mine, and I stood on that, and I went to my partners at the embassy, at the public affairs, and I said, how do I get a platform? I want to get in front of these university students. And they gave me the reading corner here, the Lincoln Library at the National Library. I went to the NUST, the Science and University. And then I also went to the Women's University in Fatima Jinnah in Rawalpindi. Let me just tell you that of all of my visits, I've had discussions with students, and we've had active conversations. The one at the Women's University was probably by far the most influential and powerful one that I've had, and it really brought it home to me as to exactly what you're talking about. How can you help us? The best thing I can think of is for us to help you help yourselves in this particular way. Normally during my talks, I say, look around this room, take a look. Do you see any circles around here? This is a pretty typical thing that psychologists do. They say, look for all the circles, and eventually they'll find a bunch, and then they start seeing circles everywhere. And I said, what I want you to do is I want you to think about trafficking as a circle and start looking for that trafficking, and you will find it. We talk about the kids who are begging in the streets. They're being trafficked locally. And we had this conversation. I gave them the presentation, the tip report and so forth. At the end, we had an open conversation. I was giving questions, these hard questions like that one. How can you help us? How can we get better? And we talked about all the recommendations in the tip line, and one of them was, and I want you to take a look on your pamphlets on the second page in the back, the very last thing we're going to be talking about is what? Establishing a national hotline, giving these people a way to call and get help. And let me also say this, it's only going to work is if the people believe that there's going to be something that's going to good come out of it. Because right now, the general feeling is, if I call the police, nothing's going to happen. And they were surprised to find out that there's an anti-human trafficking circle that has been in operation for over a decade here in Pakistan. And this kind of awareness campaign, prevention, and that's why I focus on is how to stop being a victim. We got the good students making bad decisions. So this is what we try to do is hit on that prevent, on that one P that can really hit home, and that's and I think you're missing one piece too, the intelligence agencies and law enforcement. We're also missing an opportunity for the media to get involved and do an awareness campaign and come together, government and private industries. And so I know I've been taking up a lot of time. I'm sorry for this, but there's one impactful thing that after all that conversation, this one girl raised her hand and she bravely said, this is all great, but nobody's going to listen to us. I went to the embassy, I talked to the PD, I talked to public affairs, I went to our implementing partners at INL, and I said, this is what happened. We were so taken by that story that now we have this conference. I can't take full credit. I don't know if this is actually the impetus for it, but it seems to be a coincidence, doesn't it? That this is what the people want. This is what the young girls want because they are your source of victimization. and it's coming from them. And so if anything we take from here, it's a big problem. We're not going to solve it tonight, but we can start with one small step, and that's setting up that way of identifying victims, because it's very difficult to do. They won't come forward. And it's identifying them and then taking that data from that hotline and then establishing an evolving process of how to take care of our problems.
This is Abid Lashari, and I'm president of National Disability and Development Forum, and I'm Pakistan US Alumni Network. I belong to from Sakhar chapter. So I have a question with the panel that would you like to share with us the innovative and new approaches to human trafficking in terms of investigation and enforcement? So we need to align the collaboration of US and Pakistan with Pakistani stakeholders, like we have enforcement agencies here, we have the civil society organizations here. How we can make a collaboration that we may reduce this kind of source of crime. You know, mostly children with disabilities and without disabilities are engaged in this crime as well. They are abducted and they are used in the beggary, not in the country to another country, but one city to another city. We have the examples in Pakistan, but we have the law here, but we need to implementation and how we can use the innovative approaches to reduce this crime. Thank you.
Kevin, would you like to answer, or Dan?
Can you reframe the question?
So it was really about developing collaboration, particularly to address internal trafficking, where children, especially those children who have who are special, like who have some sort of disability, how they are exploited. So how we can address those, the vulnerabilities of those children, because many of them are exploited for the purpose of begging in Pakistan.
So, as I said, the U.S., we don't have everything figured out. We're still struggling with a lot. My organization is focused on missing children. And when I say missing, in the U.S., we like to break them down into categories: runaways, foster kids, tribal children. So for us, it's very simple. A child is either missing or not. So what we're finding, especially when you get into the foster care system in the U.S., there's really no accountability. And what the traffickers have found out, they share information much better than law enforcement. They collaborate. They talk about how to get away with things. And what they found is that grooming of children, they will groom children through technology. They will develop that trust, illusion of trust, and they will have them run away from home or run away from foster care or run away. What that does is it effectively removes law enforcement from the equation, because running away is not a crime. Now, you mentioned the movie Taken. If you have a van pull up in a parking lot and grab a kid, then you've got helicopters flying overhead, you've got everybody coming out from everywhere, and traffickers don't want that. They want to avoid being seen. They want to avoid detection. They want to be in secret. So one of the things we've identified, and it's not being counted, and it's just now some federal agencies are starting to look into the states, what we're finding is there are a lot of foster kids that aren't where they're supposed to be, and nobody's looking for them. So one of the things in Pakistan, how many kids are missing in this country that nobody's looking for, that are not on the radar? It's one of the things that we find. And you talked about forced labor. Dan mentioned that. One of the big things, if you have access to kids who have no resources, they've got no place to stay, no food, you provide them with a place to stay, you provide them with food, then they've got to go out and work for that. You can get into sex trafficking, forced labor. We also see a lot of shoplifting, organized retail crime, gift card fraud, because you send that little group that you've got that are dependent on you, you send them out to do the crimes, to do the begging, to do whatever it may be. If they get arrested, it's not on me. I've got a cushion. So when we start looking at children especially, they're extremely vulnerable. So my one question to you is, how many children in this country are missing? How many of them are not where they're supposed to be? I asked that question in the US and they don't have an answer for me. It's just now starting to hit them that we have children in foster care or reservations that we don't know where they're at and nobody's looking for them. That is an opportunity for traffickers, for predators. So focus on your children, on your missing children. Where are they? And if you don't know where they are, what can you do about it to bring this to awareness?
Perhaps we can take one more. Last question, quick question and
Thank
quick
you.
reply. Ji, madam. Okay, you have the mic. Okay, sir.
Just one pertinent question regarding something specific from your experience. From your experience and understanding, since, especially Edward, since you've been here for a while, about the nefarious act of trafficking in human organs, especially in this country, to other places within the country, but also to people who require them outside in more developed countries, for example. I think it's very important to understand that this is a very major activity that tends to result in the death of the people who are the victims. And if they survive, what happens to them? And how can we improve this circumstance for those people or prevent it altogether?
You are very much right. So if anybody would like to respond. So it was about like this issue of organ trafficking, and that's very much a prevalent form in Pakistan, and we do have like a separate law that deals with the illegal transplantation of organs, but unfortunately it's not included in the Trafficking Victims Act in Pakistan. So it's not part of anti-trafficking legislation in Pakistan. But I do agree with you, whatever you have said. So before concluding the session, I would, request our panelists if they have any, last minute thought or any concluding remarks. So Dan, any quick concluding remark?
I would just want to echo what the rest of the panelists said. We clearly don't have everything figured out in the United States, so don't think that. We have hundreds of thousands of people that are being trafficked in the United States every day. In my home state of Missouri, which is, kind of a middle of the road state as far as size, we have about 3,500 people that are trafficked in our state every single day. So it's not that we have it totally figured out. And what this lady was talking about, sharing information between the provincial police, having your federal police, and training. If you just want to do one thing to really change things, just train your police properly, especially your local police, your provincial police, because they're the ones going to the suicide attempts. They're the ones going to all the calls. They're the ones that are out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What we found in the United States is once we started training patrol officers that were going out and doing this, we started finding tons of victims. I mean, one agency went from finding 0 to finding 47 a year, one agency. If you do that with all across your country, you'll find tons of victims and you'll be able to help a lot of people.
My name is Afzal Majid Bhatt. I am Senior Assignment Editor, ARY News. One question to you. A case was happening in America, Jeffrey Epstein episode. In the aftermath, has the laws updated to help victims? And do people feel they could have arrested criminal before if attitudes was changed, like the issues was not taken up by the press because of libel suits fear? And if the powerful in the United States cannot be persecuted, don't you think it would be far more greater challenge for countries like Pakistan to face those powerful elements who are taking up the TIP process, who are getting financial or other benefits, sexual benefits from this, please? Okay, so should I repeat?
Okay, so we are not taking any more questions. So perhaps Edward, when you give the closing remarks, so you can address it. So listen, please go ahead.
Do you want me to address? Okay, so if I understood his question, he was relating a case that tied back to the United States and that the powers that be were not going very far. Okay. So one of my observations of being here at this conference today was in comparing my experience in working with the United States, one of the advantages that you have right here is who you've convened in this room. So in order to be successful with this, and make progress, you have to have people who are the boots on the ground, who work in the field, who are trained on this properly, and who will do the work. But they can't do it alone. They need the support all the way up the chain of command. They need the resources, and they need the support. And what you have convened, what I see is that you have those people convened here. You have your leadership in key positions to provide the buy-in. You have to have both. And so I think really at the root of the question that the gentleman had was that we don't see that buy-in. And I've seen that in the United States, where you'll have good people trying to do good work, their boots on the ground, but they don't have support from their chain of command. They don't have the resources, and therefore they don't have the ability to move forward. So I commend you all. I commend this room. And this conference for bringing those key stakeholders to the table. That is essential.
Thank you. So quick observation or questions from this room? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Sayyida Marvi Rashdi. I'm MPA from Sindh Assembly. I need to ask a question. Since we have been discussing the human trafficking since morning, I have been listening to all the speeches, and I am unable to reach to the conclusion that human trafficking is considered as one of the organized crimes. And I believe if the crime is already organized, and it is organized and planned by some powerful groups, or you can call it mafia, then how come, forget about Pakistan, we are still developing a country like America and a superpower like America, they are unable to deal with human trafficking. It's been the global issue. So one of the honorable member, Mr. Dan Nash, said, if you could train your police. So your police is more trained compared to other countries. So how come still there is no control over the trafficking, human trafficking? Still millions of people have been trafficked globally over the years. So can you please understand? Can you please reply that how come an organized crime is not controllable? Thank you.
So in the United States, there are basically 5 main groups that do a majority of the trafficking. And you're 100% right. They're organized. Some of them loosely organized, some of them more organized than others. And I think the gist of your question was, how do we combat that? How do we combat that in the United States? How do we combat that across the world? We do have some tools in place to do that. One of the things is putting people together, like in this room, and then you have your State Department person right over here, so that the U.S. and Pakistan can work together, or the U.S. and Canada can work together, or the U.S. and whatever country can work together with how folks are being smuggled and how folks are being trafficked all across the world. Some of the tools that we also use in the United States is we prosecute people sometimes for organized crime-related crimes, racketeering-related crimes, even though that's all human trafficking. We can prosecute people for racketeering charges in the United States or under certain state organized crime statutes that are not specifically a human trafficking charge, but human trafficking can be used as that underlying crime to go after a whole organization under a racketeering charge. And then you can kind of take out the whole organization, right? Because we do have problems with that in the United States. And one of the main problems that we have there, and I don't know if it's a problem here, is with illicit massage businesses. And that's almost all organized crime. And we have 16,000 illicit massage businesses in the United States that produce about $5 billion of illicit money per year. And each massage business has between 2 and 4 victims. So that's a lot of victims. And most of those victims are Asian. They're brought to the United States. Now, most of our victims, 2/3, are persons within the United States. They're U.S. citizens. But of that third that comes to the United States, whether it's by cartels or whether it's by some other organized crime, they're international folks that come in, and that's a problem for us. So there's other ways to handle it, like through racketeering, organized crime, and having the police trained properly to do that.
Yes, please, closing
No,
remark.
I want to just say that we can think about the networks and all the organized crime, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. This is a problem that has existed for millennia. We're not going to get rid of it. But don't give in to this paralysis or this fear that how can we make a difference? Don't focus on that. What you got to focus on is, what can I do? We're not going to arrest our way out of this ever. Law enforcement cannot do this alone. But what can each one of us do to make a difference? And sometimes it just starts in our communities. How are they identifying victims where you live? You got the federal, the national level, you got regional, and you've got the local. And the local, you can do as much, and you have to do. How are they finding our victims? How are they advertising, and how are they selling? I mean, just take a look at what you can do. But we've got a saying of just one more. Even when law enforcement, we feel like, yeah, I can't do this anymore. Then the next day, it's just, all right, just one more. That's all we're going to do, just one more. You focus on that next victim. You focus on that next step. You've got the framework in place here. Now look at, how do I execute, and how do I take responsibility for my part? Don't worry about the networks. Don't worry about the mafia. They're still going to be there. They're going to do what they do, but we have to do something to make a difference. And you can do that yourself.
Yes,
Please,
my
madam.
name is
Here.
Mangla Sharma. I am the parliamentarian of Provincial Assembly of Sindh from MQM, Pakistan. My question is, Pakistan is removed from the watch list in the last year, and still he is in the tier 2. So though Pakistan is doing so many efforts, so when it will be clear from the tier 3, tier 2 in the tier 1, or clear from all this?
So it's a, sorry? Tier 2 watch list last year, and now its ranking has been improved from tier 2 watch list to tier 2. So how can we actually come into tier 1 and get rid of this, gray list ranking?
Ma'am, I mentioned earlier before, the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the U.S., is what we base our minimum standards on when we think of these rankings. And like I said, the most important thing I want everybody to walk away with here is that you're not being compared to other countries, you're being compared to yourself from last year. And so that minimum standard is what we've set the bar at for the protection, prevention, and prosecution efforts. There's so many things that go into when they compile this to give that number. It couldn't be one thing that you did right or did wrong, but it's a combination of things, correct? So one thing I want to say is, like what you said, is that we're all involved here, and you also mentioned that everybody in here in the room has an equal stake, and probably some of us more so. But I want everybody to look at I told you earlier, I talked to people about looking for circles. The 2 circles I look at whenever I talk to people about trafficking are these 2 right here. It's their eyes. A victim will tell you that they're being trafficked by, their look in their eye is usually driven by fear. It's not just fear from the traffickers, it's also fear from the authorities, because they're being forced, they're being coerced, they're being defrauded or scammed into thinking that they have no way out. We need to be able to train people to identify that, and that's what I've been doing with the hotels and the airlines and the police. But the one final thing I'd like to say here is that we're talking about victims, but we're actually talking about our cousins, our daughters, our sons, our family members. And if they can't help themselves, who are they going to turn to? And that's us. So these 2 days are critical. I've never seen this level of important people in one room to talk about one important topic. This is amazing. So I want to give yourselves a hand for that. And the last thing I'll say is, my next stop, I've got my staff in this room. I've already identified that my next stop, my next visit is going to be going back to the Fatima Jinnah University and going to see those young girls. And I want them to know that they do have a voice and that we can make a difference. So that's important.
I know many participants want to, ask questions, but since we have already passed the allocated time, so I would request you people to please, discuss your questions or concerns with our panelists during the lunch break. So I would conclude this session by thanking all the panelists, especially you who have traveled all the way from the US to participate in this conference. So thank you so much. And I'm really thankful to SSDO and Puan for organizing such a wonderful international conference. And if I'm not wrong, so this is first of its kind that we are having such a wonderful gathering of participants from all walks of life. So I'm very much hopeful that this conference will help us to develop collaboration with different stakeholders that would ultimately facilitate us to strengthen our anti-trafficking interventions. Thank you so much.